This is the most precise thing, one of the most beautiful things we've ever made. It's the thinnest smartphone ever. It uses stainless steel for strength, extraordinary build quality. I don't think there's another consumer product like this. When you hold this in your hands, it's unbelievable.
How do you follow up a hit product like the iPhone 4? I'm really pleased to tell you today all about the brand new iPhone 4S.
So, you like everything so far? Good. Well, I'll try not to blow it. We've been working on this for some time now, and we're really excited about it.
The iPhone 4S was announced on October 4th, 2011, retaining the premium design of the iPhone 4 while massively upgrading the internal hardware as well as the software, specifically with iOS 5, as you had the introduction of Siri, the first mainstream digital assistant, and iCloud, a service that represented the beginning of the cloud-based takeover in tech. The 4S was a game changer in the smartphone industry and tech industry as a whole, as were many of the early iPhones, transforming the market and leading into what would eventually become the norm a full decade later. As a neat monument to the iPhone 4S, this year was sent to me from a company called Grid. They actually take apart iPhone 4S's piece by piece and frame them with labels surrounding all the parts, and it's just really cool. I'm not sponsored, but they sent this out to me, and so I will have a link in the description. It's not an affiliate link, but I wanted to shout them out because I thought this was super cool. It's really special seeing things like the A5 chip up close. Just, it's so small. You never think of it being this small, but it is. The iPhone 4S is one of those iPhones that you can't help but feel nostalgia towards, even if it's often overshadowed in retrospect by the revolutionary iPhone 4 and ever so popular iPhone 5. But today we are going to be talking about that forgotten middle child, a phone that might not seem as memorable as some of its siblings, but in many ways was every much as influential. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, if you don't know me. We are going to take some time here and establish the context and story behind the iPhone 4S. If that's something you would rather skip, timestamps will be in the description below. Personally, I just find it all so interesting, just the circumstances surrounding these huge revolutions in technology. I almost find it more interesting than the device itself, especially when it's something we've had in our hands for 10 years already. And that's not to downplay the 4S's hardware or how it holds up today. Looking at the design and trying to use it with iOS 9, while it's slow, it's impressive just how close it comes to being a somewhat usable experience. That's a purposely vague descriptor here because if we're being real, it is usable. For basics in phone calling and iMessage and email, you could still use the 4S. You might want to throw the phone off a bridge, but it still works, albeit limited by 3G networking. 3G networking gives us some early context to the time frame this phone came out in, although it was released right on the cusp of 4G LTE becoming more and more commonplace. Today we're going to be starting the story of the iPhone 4S where things always begin, with the iPhone that was released the year prior. Now, obviously, Apple does have their phones in development for 2 to 3 years before they're actually announced. There is a lot of time required to bring a smartphone from the design phase all the way to manufacturing, so there's enough available for initial adopters. That's why I've often said that the iPhone 5 was truly the final phone Steve Jobs would have had significant input on, and if anything proves this, I think it's the sudden shift in design language in 2013 with the launch of the iPhone 5C, 5S, and iOS 7. But the iPhone 4S is a phone that Jobs essentially saw from the beginning to the end, at least nearly, and the story here starts with the unveiling of the iPhone 4 on June 7th, 2010.
In 2007, iPhone reinvented what we think of as a phone. In 2008, we added 3G networking and the App Store. In 2009, the iPhone 3GS was twice as fast. For 2010, we're going to take the biggest leap since the original iPhone. And so today, we're introducing iPhone 4.
On the 10th anniversary of the iPhone 4, I took a pretty in-depth look at the phone if you're interested, so I'll link that in the description. But there are many takeaways from the 2010 smartphone that apply to the iPhone 4S. The design, the Retina display, and so much more. That design firstly, it was the first of its kind on any smartphone, in an era where basically every phone was plastic, including even iPhone. The first iPhone had an aluminum build, but the 3G and 3GS featured a glossy polycarbonate casing that looked nicer than a lot of the competition competition, but was still within a similar class. The iPhone 4, however, flipped this all on its head, scrapping the plastic completely, along with that rounded, chunky look we were all so familiar with, moving to a rectangular, flat and smooth glass backing, with it held in place by the polished stainless steel frame, one that looked and felt just miles more premium than the ones on previous iPhones. The iPhone 4 wasn't just in a different class from other smartphones, it was in a different league altogether. It was so ridiculously far ahead of the competition. When it came to some aspects of the phone, it would take multiple years for some others to catch up, and in some cases even longer. This was really the first modern smartphone as we think of them today, with Android not having yet found its footing and BlackBerry petering out very quickly. The iPhone 4 did more than just bring the glass design. Glass being the material most smartphones use today to accommodate for wireless charging, by the way, so it was massively ahead of its time there. But the real upgrade was actually in the display, which was unparalleled in resolution and quality. It may still have only had 3.5 inches, but the resolution was 960 by 640, making for that retina pixel density of 326 pixels per inch. This was so far beyond anything else out there, and it was game-changing. It made content actually look good with no easily visible pixels to the naked eye. Older iPhones look blurry and messy in comparison, and the screen gap there is immediately noticeable as well. The 4 also had Apple's first laminated display, fusing the top glass and LCD panel together to make everything feel perfectly at your fingertips instead of simply behind the glass that you were touching. The iPhone 4 was the first iPhone with a selfie camera, and it brought it with FaceTime on iOS 4. The back camera was 5 megapixels and had HDR for the first time, able to record video in high definition with 720p. Plus there was a flash, something that was new to iPhone. The Apple A4 chipset powered the device, being Apple's first custom chipset designed by themselves, and we all know what that's led to today with the M1 and beyond in their newer Macs. The iPhone 4 was, in a certain sense, one of Steve Jobs' last gifts to the world. Yet another leap forward in technology unseen since the first iPhone. But the iPhone 4, for all its innovations, wasn't perfect, but far from it, with Apple's first big hit to their reputation coming with the whole Antenna Gate controversy. Essentially, Antenna Gate spawned from the iPhone 4's tendency to drop phone calls seemingly at random. The source of this problem came from the antenna band being covered by your hand right there on the bottom left of the device, and as long as you didn't hold it there or had a case surrounding it, it would be fine, but it was still a pretty ridiculous issue. It really sucks because it sullied an otherwise near perfect smartphone. Luckily, we did see CDMA models of the iPhone 4 fix this by changing the positioning of the antenna bands, and you would see that carry over to the iPhone 4S, making Antenna Gate a complete non-factor. Why bother taking so much time going over what the iPhone 4 brought to the table? Well, there's a couple main reasons. For one thing, everything I've mentioned here carried over to the iPhone 4S. Same design, same display, and even better internal hardware, as we now know to be the standard of an S upgrade. But the iPhone 4 set a certain precedent. It blew people away. It made the iPhone 3GS and everything else look almost silly in contrast, even possibly too much so, as it raised people's expectations of Apple to an unsustainable level. Apple wasn't going to be able to produce such a giant leap forward year over year, but at this new, young, and very exciting age of early smartphones, really anything seemed possible, and the hopes for the 2011 iPhone 4S would be intensely high because of it. Something that had plagued the iPhone 4 before its unveiling were leaks and rumors, to the point that a prototype iPhone 4 was found in the wild when it was left in a bar and sold by the finder to Gizmodo, a tech news publication. Jobs was livid at the situation, but in 2010, for better or for worse, everyone knew what the new iPhone was going to look like before it would even be announced, hence Jobs' famous opener at the keynote.
Now, stop me if you've already seen this. Believe me, you ain't seen it. You've got to see this thing in person. It is one of the most beautiful designs you've ever seen.
There would be a record-long 15-month gap between the iPhone 4 and 4S, as Apple moved to a fall release schedule for iPhone, something that they're still doing to this day. This meant that there was even more time for rumors to be spread and expectations to be raised. And within the tech community, looking back, there were some pretty bold ideas of what exactly this new iPhone would entail. For one thing, people were calling the 4S the iPhone 5, which might seem odd, but keep in mind that the whole S naming scheme hadn't been too established yet. In fact, iPhone names had kind of been all over the place. You had simply iPhone, then iPhone 3G due to it having 3G networking, then 3GS with the phone looking the same but being significantly faster, thus the S stood for speed. And then came along the iPhone 4, 4 being a very sensible name to go to after the 3GS, as this was in fact the fourth iPhone. It seemed like Apple had finally gotten to a stable pattern, with assumedly each subsequent iPhone being the next number up. But instead, Apple would release the iPhone 4S as it improved the iPhone 4 on the inside, but like the 3GS looked basically identical. This meant the 2012 iPhone 5 would actually be the sixth iPhone, and of course at this point the entire iPhone line is a confusing mess when it comes to name continuity, with more and more adjectives being added what feels like every year. Unrelated by the way, but I do have to say I'm so hyped for next year's iPhone 14 Air Pro Max Plus SE. I'm joking a bit here, but the point is there were high expectations for the supposed iPhone 5. And looking back, there were definitely some rumors mixed in for what was coming in 2012, not just 2011, namely being a larger screen and thinner casing. There were also articles talking about two phones coming out, the iPhone 4S and the iPhone 5, both at the same time. The 4S being a budget option looking like the 4, whereas the 5 would have been a new design altogether. This of course wouldn't happen, and it's possible that they simply had rumors for two different phones, being literally the 2011 4S and the 2012 iPhone 5, and we're just combining them, or maybe they were actually onto something, as that cheaper option being rumored is quite interesting given that it would eventually happen 2 years later with the iPhone 5C in 2013. Perhaps it was an early leak of that future phone, or maybe it was complete speculation, or it may have actually been founded on something legitimate, which we'll get to shortly. I was surprised by a few rumors that were out there, and when I say out there, I mean like really out there. They made very little sense, such as a fully new home button. There was this supposed prototype case featuring a large ovular home button, along with a still rounded design and a seemingly near edge-to-edge display. There was an interesting rumor in a 9 to 5 Mac report from March 2011 saying that Apple had an iPhone with a flat metal back in the works. This seemed to be incorrect initially, but as we all know, they were actually onto something. There were also a good few correct rumors, including extensive voice controls, which turned out to be Siri. At the time, some people thought this would be a copy of the more robust voice controls on the Android side, but of course Siri reached far and beyond any of that, although it wouldn't take too long for everyone else to catch up. The A5 chipset was expected with its dual cores, as it had been already introduced with the iPad 2nd generation, March 2011. It was rumored that they would combine the GSM and CDMA models together, having a dual mode radio, and they were correct there. Basically, different carriers used different radio bands. Verizon, for example, was CDMA, and AT&T was GSM. 4G LTE had been rumored, but that didn't happen. However, download speeds did get a significant boost, so they weren't too far off. As for the camera, which was a huge upgrade with the 4S, there was actually a photo taken by an Apple employee and posted to Flickr that September, and people quickly noticed that the resolution was much higher than that of the iPhone 4, pointing to 8 megapixels instead of 5. This wasn't as much of a slip up as that Apple employee who left his prototype iPhone 4 on his bar stool, but still a pretty big mistake, and the photo was quickly privated after people figured it out. The theory of two phones coming in 2011 actually held a lot more water than I originally expected while researching the 4S. I thought perhaps it was an early leak pointing to the iPhone 5C, but recently there was actually a mention of an unreleased iPhone that was found from a document shared in the Epic versus Apple trial. Specifically, this October 2010 email from Steve Jobs regarding a meeting agenda. If you look straight to the bottom of the page, we can see a bullet point for an iPhone Nano of all things, along with a subpoint for cost goal and another saying Johnny Ive would show a model and or renderings. We can already assume this would have been a budget iPhone, likely designed differently and maybe even smaller given the Nano name, and looking higher on the page, we might be able to get a better idea of what this was. Since this was a meeting agenda, I think we can assume that this section here, right around the lower third of the page, was going to be some kind of outline for the meeting, or this part of the meeting. We've got the header 2011 strategy, first with talk about a Plus iPhone 4, then an LTE version coming in mid-2012, and finally a low-cost iPhone model based on iPod Touch to replace the 3GS. The first point regarding the Plus iPhone 4 is most definitely what would have eventually become the iPhone 4S, as it even perfectly describes what the 4S was: better antenna, processor, camera, and software. The LTE version coming in mid-2012 2012 is kind of interesting. Of course, the iPhone 5 was the first LTE iPhone coming in late 2012, and the 4S never had an LTE version. So I think we can assume this is actually referencing that iPhone 5. This email was sent back in 2010 before Apple had started releasing their iPhones in the fall, and in fact still did it at WWDC around June. So I think it's likely that they probably expected this would continue. The iPhone 5 is also talked about a bit later on, so for me, that pretty much confirms it. Then after that, the iPhone Nano plan is mentioned, likely being the same low-cost iPhone from higher up, though there's no way to know for sure. If it were to be based on the iPod Touch, I'd imagine this would mean a lighter, thinner, rounded design with likely lower spec internals, and probably the same display size as the current iPhones at the time, as 3.5 inches was the smallest and biggest Apple had ever done. So it would still fit the iPhone Nano name more or less, just because it would be lighter and thinner, though I wouldn't have been surprised if they had changed that. The Nano subtitle has unfortunately been dead since 2017 when the iPod Nano was discontinued, although we do have the iPhone Mini now, specifically of course the 12 mini and 13 mini, and there's a good chance we'll see an iPhone 14 mini as well. As for the alleged iPhone Nano, I really hope those models or renderings or whatever was done with it eventually one day leak, because I'm so curious what a budget iPhone from under Steve Jobs would have looked like. The iPhone 5C is kind of a fun phone, but it was a disaster for Apple, not selling well and not being much of a budget option at all. Regardless, I think it's safe to say this is where the two phones rumor came from, even if it wasn't clear what the phones would be. Overall, this isn't too relevant to the 4S we have today. I just find it super interesting, and while there was some initial disappointment at the 4S's launch from a good few, the general reception was very positive, and reviews heralded the phone as a solid upgrade, with it selling the fastest of any iPhone so far, and very quickly being used and enjoyed by millions and millions of people around the world. This doesn't change the fact, however, that the hardware jump wasn't anywhere near as substantial as the iPhone 4 over the 3GS, and the 4S wasn't going to be remotely as exciting, no matter what, even with Siri. With smartphones being so new at the time and these design changes seen on Android phones hitting year after year, the iPhone would look less and less appealing, and over the 4S's lifetime, we began to see the end of Apple's complete and utter dominance in the smartphone landscape as companies like Samsung started to more and more catch up with features Apple just didn't have, like the mid-2012 Galaxy S3's huge 4.8-inch AMOLED display. All this being said, it doesn't change that the iPhone 4S brought a lot more than people realized in 2011 and was a truly innovative device, just one that wasn't as obviously so as the iPhone 4 was, bringing subtle but imperative features fundamental to the smartphones of the future.
Of course it starts with the Retina display. Of course it's glass in the front and back, and has that incredible stainless steel band around it, making it the thinnest smartphone. But don't be deceived, because inside it is all new. Performance that's up to twice as fast at CPU tasks. Graphics can be up to 7 times faster than they were in the previous iPhone. An 8-megapixel sensor. That's 60% more pixels than were in the iPhone 4's camera sensor, and it takes stunning photos. And for the first time, it is now 1080p HD video. It's the best iPhone yet.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it?
The iPhone 4S was, and perhaps still is in retrospect, a phone that I think has always been undervalued and underrated. It had the same design and nature as the 2010 iPhone 4. The phone looked the same, thus it was the same. And in 2011, Apple was simply throwing out yet another cash grab for their millions of sheep to eat up, regardless of how little really changed. This wasn't a completely unpopular opinion back in the day, and it probably still isn't. While the 4S wasn't a paradigmal shift like the iPhone 4 was, it did improve a few absolutely essential aspects of the device and was by no means a pointless or even small upgrade. It's so easy to discount something brand new if it doesn't have the initial appearance of being brand new. It's much more difficult to see past that and judge something as it is, not as it was. The 4S didn't get poor reviews, but the lack of change in design played a large part in Samsung's growing dominance as consumers drifted towards the larger, more exciting devices. In a time where the real appeal of smartphones was in fact the excitement of owning such a product. The novelty was still there, the touchscreen was still this new, crazy, amazing technology, and with mobile gaming getting bigger and bigger, so did the imaginations of what these phones could do. The 4S was a solid, strong upgrade, but it didn't feel new, and that hurt its reputation both in the short and long term as the media hyped up a thinner, larger iPhone 5. The 4S was unveiled on October 4th, 2011, a single day before Steve Jobs would pass away. Jobs' last keynote had been that June, where where he announced iCloud, yet another underrated innovation that spawned from his reign, setting the scene for the cloud-based future we see ourselves in today. It's actually quite amazing just how many features and services came out around 2011 that would end up becoming mainstays in the industry. iOS 5 was an impressive update, and we'll get to that. But first, the unveiling and subsequent launch of the iPhone 4S.
A lot of excitement today, a lot of people walking out of here with new iPhones.
It's better, it's faster, and it has artificial intelligence on it, so it's really good. I really like it.
This is the first iPhone launch since the passing of Steve Jobs. Most experts believe weekend sales will range from 2 to 3 million units.
Fully retaining the gorgeous design and display of the iPhone 4, the new iPhone focused on improving and refining the experience in every possible facet. An upgraded camera, faster tech specs, and best-in-class software with iOS 5. It's hard not to feel nostalgic looking at a 4S on its original software. It's truly beautiful, even if the skeuomorphic aesthetic doesn't fit in with the modern age of design. iOS 5 would actually be the final major update with this old look, as iOS 6 would more focus on performance as well as changing up a few UI elements, before in 2013 we of course got that bright and flat iOS 7. When it comes to the new hardware, the most exciting addition was the 8 megapixel camera sensor on the rear, upgraded from the 5 megapixels on the iPhone 4, and now capable of filming 1080p video. And considering this is a 10-year-old camera, as you can see here, pictures are shockingly impressive. Obviously nowhere near what is possible on phones today, but in bright, well-lit conditions and with HDR on the 4S, it can absolutely take a nice shot. These pictures are kind of fine. They're not good by at least today's standards, but it's at least easy to decipher what's happening in the photo, versus the mess of pixels many other smartphones still captured around this time frame. Now the 4S can be kind of inconsistent. It doesn't have the same stabilization benefits that we have today, so even when you're holding the phone what feels like very still, you can end up with a blurry image. Meaning, I think the best method is to just take a whole bunch of pictures and hope one of them turns out. Video in that 1080p is half decent, and I'd say for a 10-year-old camera, this is aged just spectacularly, especially given it's a smartphone camera. Powering the iPhone 4S was Apple's A5 chipset, the successor to the A4 from the year before, which had been the first one Apple designed themselves. And as we know now today, from the A4 and its many future counterparts, we'd eventually get Apple Silicon and Macs, and the power is ridiculously efficient. Apple Silicon is more and more looking like the future, at least for Apple, and the 4S's A5 chipset was their first dual-core chip in a smartphone. Double the cores means a faster, more capable device, to the point that it would get 5 years of software updates, something that probably shouldn't have happened, but it's impressive that it did all the same. The amount of RAM in the 4S stayed the same at 512 megabytes, a number that was okay for the time, but would definitely hurt later on. Storage saw a bump, with the maximum option being 64 gigabytes, which was sold along 16 and 32 gig options as well. 16 gigs is pretty rough now, but in 2011 with the older software and generally small apps, it wasn't such a big deal. What really sucked was only having 8 gigabytes, which Apple, in all their infinite wisdom, would release September 2013. Yeah, they had an 8 gig iPhone 4S that came free with a 2-year contract, being the budget option versus the 5C and 5S, a deal that undoubtedly seemed great to some unfortunate customers back in the day, but using an 8 gig 4S until 2015 would likely prove to be a beyond frustrating experience. And I'm still disappointed Apple bothered doing that, especially when there wasn't even an 8 gig option in the first place. So these were the main improvements seen with the 4S, and the things everyone was talking about on the hardware side. What Apple really wanted you to focus on, however, was their all-new digital assistant in Siri, an artificial intelligence-based voice control that was supposed to be able to carry out tasks and provide information as naturally as possible, with you simply having to speak to Siri like you would an actual person. Early on, Siri was pretty rudimentary, but it was very cool tech, and there were genuinely good uses for her, like asking the weather, or to set a reminder, or maybe texting with just your voice. Many reviewers even went as far to say that Siri was the reason you should buy the 4S. Not the camera, not the hardware, but Siri. And well, in hindsight, I might disagree, but it's hard not to take digital assistants for granted at this point, as the market is completely oversaturated with them. It was also noted by some more technical journalists just how impressive the A5 chipset truly was, along with the insane boost in gaming performance that it brought. It compared shockingly close to the PlayStation Vita, which was also from 2011, plus some were even comparing it to the PS3 and Xbox 360. Besides the disappointment from some in no iPhone 5, the reception was overall quite warm towards the 4S, with the common conclusion being that it was worthy of a buy if you weren't already using the still great iPhone 4. The 4S wasn't without its problems though, and a major one was durability. Glass is commonplace today for the sake of wireless charging, but in the early 2010s there really wasn't any use for it, except, you know, it looked cool. And from this spawned the onslaught of spiderwebbed iPhone 4s and 4Ss, along with a huge rise in popularity of cases as people wanted to protect their precious, expensive glass and metal sandwiches. It's honestly quite funny to me that of all the changes to the 4S, it was really Siri that was the most desired among enthusiasts. It's one of those things that's just so easy to ignore now. Heck, I don't remember the last time I even unironically used Siri, but back then it was novel, it was new, it was cool, just like the touchscreens had been and still were in 2011, or how that newer edge-to-edge design in the iPhone X was so crazy only a few years back. But Siri wasn't the only software addition, with iOS 5 releasing, and as already mentioned, it was a bigger upgrade than you might remember.
About 10 years ago, we had one of our most important insights, and that was that the PC was going to become the digital hub for your digital life. Basically, sync it to the Mac, and everything was going to work fine. And it did for the better part of 10 years. But it's broken down in the last few years. And keeping these devices in sync is driving us crazy. We've got a great solution for this problem. And we think this solution is our next big insight, and we call it iCloud. It just all works.
iOS 5 was the 5th major release of iOS. I know, shocker, although it really was more the second release of iOS, succeeding iOS 4. Yeah, second, as technically speaking, what we would think of as iOS 1, 2, and 3 were at the time labeled iPhone OS, and this changed with iOS 4 instead of iPhone OS 4. It made sense with the 2010 iPad and of course iPod Touch already being around, so the title of iPhone OS just didn't cover the range of Apple devices. As more and more hardware upgrades came in the form of the A5 dual-core chipset, suddenly Apple had so much more power to work with than ever before, and so they aimed to take advantage with iOS 5. When it comes to a new version of iOS, Apple always has their hands tied, as does Google when it comes to Android, as you need the software to be compatible and functional on older devices that aren't yet ready to be retired. This means you can't gear it fully to the newer hardware, but you can add extra features to the newer phones without too much backlash. For example, wallpapers weren't on the first or second iPhone, only the iPhone 3GS and better. At least home screen wallpapers, you still had them on the lock screen. And now Siri, of course, was coming in the brand new iPhone 4S, and in June 2012, iPad support would follow. But was Siri really so power hungry that you couldn't run it on, say, the iPhone 4? The answer is no, not really. In fact, it didn't take long for hackers to get fully working Siri on older devices, though they notably were slower than the 4S. It comes down to Apple simply wanting to sell their newest product, with their flashy new digital assistant only being available on the latest and greatest iPhone, though originally, believe it or not, it was supposed to be coming to both BlackBerry and Android. That's right, BlackBerry and Android. Siri originally wasn't an Apple project. It was a standalone application released February 2010 for iOS, and the company had plans to bring it to other platforms in the future. This, of course, would fall through, however, when Apple would acquire Siri only 2 months after the app came out, clearly seeing the immediate potential and not hesitating to scoop it up. The app actually remained on the App Store until Apple announced the iPhone 4S, at which time Siri was integrated into the OS itself and the standalone app disappeared. Critics would point out that the app could run on the iPhone 4, and yet by removing it from the store, it can now only be used on the 4S. And yeah, Apple wanted to sell the new phone. Siri from 2011 was honestly not hugely different from today's Siri. She sounds a lot less natural and is a lot more limited in scope, go, but it was still miles ahead of the bare-bone voice control features seen before. You could of course hold down the home button, Siri would pop up, and you can ask her many basic questions like what is the weather, or tell her to do basic tasks like make a phone call or send out a text message.
What is the weather like today?
Here's the forecast for today.
It is that easy.
Apple was also very smart when it came to what Siri couldn't do. Often, she'd simply default to searching for the query on the web, and hopefully this would solve your problem, and if not, well, hey, Google pretty much solves anything, right? It's actually kind of funny to me just how similar iOS 5 Siri is to modern-day Siri. She sounds much more robotic, but she can do a surprising amount of things that she can do today. 10 years later, Siri has fallen behind much of the competition, but is still competent enough for the vast majority of people out there. Honestly, I've used voice assistants so little in like the last 5 years, I really can't be bothered to care too much, but if I ever need Siri, she's always at my beck and call. And while digital assistants may have happened regardless, you do still have to thank the 2011 iPhone 4S for thrusting them into the mainstream. My favorite thing about Siri was always the joke messages, things like when you ask for a joke, or the meaning of life, or the classic old asking her to beatbox for you.
Here's one I've been practicing. Boots and cats and boots and cats and boots and cats and boots and cats and boots. I could do this all day. Cats and boots and 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 cats.
I definitely enjoyed Siri the most when I first was able to use her. When Siri came out, I had a crappy Android phone, so of course I didn't have anything like it. And so when I finally got an iPhone 5C and could mess around with Siri, I had a lot of fun just asking her dumb questions all the time. And I'm noticing I call Siri a her. I'm not really sure if you can give an AI a gender, but Apple added a male voice in 2013, so you could use either or, and now there's a pretty wide selection. Hey Siri would come September 2015 with iOS 9, so hopefully it set it off for you too. Basically it's a voice prompt so you can activate Siri without ever touching your phone, and she just told me she's not sure she understands. There have been many additions added to Siri over the years, but you get the idea. Without a doubt, there was a certain magic and charm to Siri that may have mainly faded by now, but there's no denying the impact the features had on the tech market, even spawning an entirely new type of device in smart speakers down the road. Oh, and you might not remember hearing about the original voice actress, but that was an interesting story. The voice actress for Siri, Susan Bennett, had provided her voice back in July 2005 and was completely unaware it would eventually be one of the most heard voices on the planet. I'd imagine that was quite the shock. But I think that's enough about Siri, at least for now. And while this was the most enticing feature of iOS 5, there was a lot more to it than first met the eye. We won't spend too much time on iOS 5 as this video's subject is still supposed to be the 4S. But as we all know, new iOS versions and new iPhones always go hand in hand with Apple. Early iOS 5 was reportedly a bit buggy for 4S users, but these problems would be fixed quickly, and the features the software brought more than made up for the temporary inconvenience. iOS 5 revamped notifications, bringing Notification Center for the first time, and that was, you know, kind of important. iCloud was here, synchronizing all of your data and content across your Apple iCloud enabled devices, and iMessage was new here as well, now being able to communicate with other Apple devices with only your Apple ID and Wi-Fi. This was especially awesome for iPod Touch users, as they could basically text without a SIM card on Wi-Fi, as long as the person they wanted to contact were on an iOS device. The big improvements didn't stop here. Now for the first time, you didn't always have to plug your phone into your computer to update it, but instead update wirelessly over the internet within the Settings app. It's crazy to think such a simple thing like this would have made a world of difference. And before this, you had to have a computer with iTunes if you ever even wanted to update. And of course, it's led to this current world of people solely using smartphones and not ever using a computer for anything. Think about it. It's amazing nowadays how many people know how to use a smartphone so well, but if you put a laptop in front of them, all you get is blank stares, kind of a 180 from 10 years ago. It speaks to how intuitive iOS has been, but also just how society and tech and how we use it has shifted so drastically. Something I'm really not a fan of looking back was Apple's attempt to integrate Twitter throughout the OS. Twitter was already huge and quickly on the rise, and I suppose Apple wanted to hop on that train first, though naturally it wouldn't last. Oh, here's a cool thing. iOS 5 brought the camera shortcut to the lock screen for the first time. One of the most useful features even today, in all honesty. I'd love to go through every single little tidbit about iOS 5, but we don't really have the time, so the last thing I'll say concerning new additions is that this was the first time the iPod app was replaced by separate favorite music and video apps. You might have forgot this used to be a completely different icon. Though on actual iPods with the iPod Touch, you actually already had the music and video apps even from the first iPod, so they just standardized it across the board. I've been showing a couple phones on iOS 5 that I got years ago off eBay, but recently I actually found this iPhone 4S here in a barrel of scrap phones. It was submerged in water, but with a battery replacement it magically still works fine, and it happens to be on iOS 5.0.1, meaning at most it was updated only once in its lifetime, and it's very clearly jailbroken with many icons on the homepage here. I actually did a video just a bit ago going over the whole story of this phone because it's absolutely insane, but essentially it appears someone lost it in February 2012 and it's been untouched ever since. I'll link that video in the description if you'd like to watch it later, but it does give us some insight into the jailbreaking scene for around the time. One could make the argument that the handful of years around the iOS 5 days was the golden age of jailbreaking, and it would be justified. It's amazing to see all the customizability and innovation brought to early iOS, with many features even eventually making it into Apple's own official releases, albeit with their own spin on everything. Tweaks like Springtomize here let you do basically anything with the phone and its UI, or Barrel here has always been one of my favorites. You choose a transition then swipe page to page with your chosen animation, like spinning around or whatever. It's just so fun, and it's something that Apple would probably never implement themselves. They love having a uniform experience. One iPhone is like every other iPhone, and adding too much customizability kind of takes away from that. All in all, iOS 5 was a huge update in furthering many aspects of the smartphone takeover, with foundational improvements that would lead to modern implementations. But beyond all that, you also had the beginning of the cloud-based era, where in conjunction with the consumption of media moving to internet streaming, we'd all begin more and more storing our photos on the cloud and using various services to sync everything together, all wirelessly on all of our devices. iMessage was introduced. That was huge. And since then, we've seen this weird cultural phenomena of people buying iPhones solely to avoid having those dreaded green bubbles you get when communicating outside of Apple's ecosystem. And of course, do I even need to mention Siri again? iOS 5 was one of the most integral updates Apple's ever released, and one that's so easy to forget. The iPhone 4S was a pretty subtle upgrade, and iOS 6 was the final skeuomorphic version, coming a year later, and thus gets a lot of attention looking back. iOS 7 may have overhauled the design and brought a lot to the Apple experience, but I would argue that iOS 5 was actually in many ways more important. Visually, it didn't change much, but under the hood, the software was getting more and more powerful, and 10 years later, I mean, iOS 15 is absolutely fantastic. There's tons of issues, don't get me wrong, but putting things in perspective, the amount of things we're able to do on these tiny devices that fit in our pockets, well, it's amazing. The 4S may not have lived to see too close to iOS 15, but it would get a pretty good taste of the more modern iOS experience. And while that might sound like a good thing, the reality is it hurt more users than it helped.
How do I get to Charlie Grant's house?
Here are directions to Charlie Grant's house.
Is it cold in Santa Fe, Raleigh, Cleveland tonight?
Really cold, down to about 14 degrees.
Find that email with the naughty or nice list.
New message from Mrs. Claus. Go easy on the cookies.
How does the rest of my day look?
You have 3.7 billion appointments.
The iPhone 4S to this day is still one of the most innovative smartphones ever developed and released, not just by Apple, but by anyone. As we've thoroughly established, it brought so much to the table, all in a subtle package with that same old design. And it's because of those innovations and powerful hardware, the 4S would end up remaining relevant as long as it did throughout the past decade. It would be the first iPhone to receive 5 years of software support. No small feat, to be sure, though not necessarily one that ought to be commended in this particular case. iOS 5 and iOS 6 were naturally both extremely fast on the iPhone 4S. While to some, the skeuomorphic aesthetic was aging rapidly, the software experience was unparalleled in consistent performance and reliability. Going back and using a 4S on either OS has the phone running like a dream, just blazing fast moving around the system and able to handle any of the typical basics you do regularly without any problem. Slowdowns just don't happen, and that's how it should have been when you were using iOS 5 and iOS 6 on the 4S, the phone was only at most 1 to 2 years old. Unfortunately, after iOS 5 and iOS 6, this would no longer be the case. In 2013, you saw the release of the iPhone 5S, and along with it, iOS 7, completely reimagining iOS in a flatter, brighter, and more colorful look versus the pseudo-realism of previous iOS. iOS 7 was both criticized and extremely well received. Detractors would argue that it was copying Android, moving away from what made iPhone look so special, while the vast majority of the user base was simply excited to just have a fresh new experience for the first time since iPhone came out. Whatever your opinion might be now, with the privilege of 2020 hindsight, there's no question that iOS 7 was indeed exciting and a breath of fresh air in Apple's lineup. It also made sense to move away from the skeuomorphic look. As much as I've always loved it, a big reason that it made so much sense to use it in the first place was due to how it subtly informed the user the purpose of certain functions. The Notes app would look like a notebook, the newsstand was a bookshelf, reminders a checklist, and so on and so forth. Even though the app names are there, in the early days of smartphones, this was all still so new to everyone. The ubiquitous skeuomorphism was utilized by Apple to create connections between the apps and their users, helping people establish subconsciously what certain apps or features did. While iOS 7 was often called a clone of Android, Android in its early days actually subscribed to a similar visual policy as Apple. Looking at this old HTC Thunderbolt, for example, you can see many of the app icons are 3D and have some kind of depth and realistic element to them. There's not a lot of consistency across all of them, but it allows users to connect their apps to their intended purpose without consciously thinking about it. And by the time iOS 7 came around, smartphones and what they could do had already become so well established and understood that Apple felt free to depart from their iconic past, moving into the future and a design that, while much different from today, still doesn't really feel too out of place next to the most recent iterations of iOS. Sure, most every app icon is different now, sometimes radically and sometimes not, but the look remains the same. The iPhone 4 on iOS 7 and the iPhone 13 Pro on iOS 15 look like devices that came from the same phone maker, whereas iOS 6 really only strikes familiar due to the same old grid layout and the symbols or shapes on the icons themselves. Perhaps the most important two additions of iOS 7 were the brand new Control Center and reworked multitasking. The multitasker no longer only showed the app icons, requiring you to go through the process of deleting them to close your apps, but instead actually showed the app windows in a convenient way that let you scroll through them or swipe up to close one, plus you could see what was going on without actually going into the app. The Control Center had kind of existed, but now you could just swipe up from the bottom, and then you get access to not only media controls, but a whole variety of useful functions like screen brightness, networking toggles, and a dedicated flashlight, all for the first time. So why am I focusing on iOS 7? It's interesting, but it doesn't have that much to do with the 4S, right? As always, I have my reasons. For one, it radically changed up the experience for every single iPhone user that could run iOS 7, very much including the still fairly recent iPhone 4S. But it also caused a ridiculous amount of slowdown on Apple's oldest devices. With the initial releases, there were these crazy slow animations, which combined with the many transparency effects and fancy visual gimmicks would cause your previously reliable and speedy iPhone 4 to feel slow and bloated, thus starting the entire debate around Apple allegedly slowing down your phone with their updates to get you to buy a new one. The iPhone 4S wasn't the oldest phone to get iOS 7, with the iPhone 4 being updatable. And the 4 was slow. It really was just slow. Luckily, the 4S ran iOS 7 much better than the iPhone 4 thanks to the dual-core chipset, albeit with that same amount of RAM. And while I wouldn't describe using my own 4S on iOS 7 that I have as pleasant, it's what I would expect of a 2011 smartphone running power-hungry software. But in a certain sense, Apple giving iOS 7 to the iPhone 4 left them in a bit of a pickle, one that really started with the 3GS getting iOS 6 in the first place, as the iPhone 3G had only gotten to iOS 4. Apple had broken their own pattern of newer iPhones only getting a single extra year of updates, and they did it because the 3GS was pretty easily capable of running iOS 6, which had been so similar to iOS 5. It was a very consumer-friendly move by Apple, but it did mean the iPhone 4 seemingly needed to get that extra iOS 7 update in order to have a year over the old device. While iOS 7 on the iPhone 4 was slow and should have been better optimized, I'll say that I think Apple did the right thing letting the phone update. The iPhone 4 had only come out in 2010, making it just 3 years old at the launch of iOS 7 and the 5S. That might seem hard to believe given the changes that took place between the two phones, but those still using the iPhone 4 around 2013 2013 and 2014, including myself when I was a kid, were definitely grateful for that extra year and that fresh new redesign. With the iPhone 4 now running iOS 7, this meant that following Apple's own patterns, the iPhone 4S would have to, in the very least, run iOS 8. And that is exactly what happened with the update coming in 2014, not bringing a ton over the previous iteration, with general refinements and typical minor upgrades across the board. But of course, as with most new updates, iOS 8 was even slower on the 4S than iOS 7 was. The 4S and its half gigabyte of RAM was really starting to be obvious by this point, and the A5, while amazing in 2011, was already way behind what phones were capable of only 3 years later. Smartphones around this time were still seeing substantial jumps in performance year to year, which really hurt older devices in the aging process. But whilst I complain, I have to admit that it made sense for Apple to give the update, as they wouldn't want 4S owners to feel cheated having their 3-year-old phone being retired at the same time as a 4-year-old phone in the iPhone 4. So while it was a bit slow, the 4S was still functional, and iOS 8 meant that it got to use most of the latest and greatest features combined with more consistent app support. Something you would typically still get for a couple years after losing updates, but after that you would be stuck using the latest compatible versions of apps, assuming your account had downloaded them before. This doesn't apply to every app. Some services just stopped supporting old versions of iOS. Some apps never were on old versions of iOS, like Disney Plus can't run on iOS 9, for example. However, overall, this would help extend life of iPhones even longer. But of course, everyone still wants to be on the latest and greatest operating system if they can be. And thus, the iPhone 4S would end its life on iOS 8, not running as smoothly as it used to, but still good enough to get you by. The end, and everyone lived happily ever after. Except, of course, why would I spend this long hyping up the 4S's legacy if it truly ended in such an anticlimactic and reasonable fashion, right? Fall 2015 marked the release of the iPhone 6S and 6S Plus, bringing huge jumps in processing power to the point both phones are still supported on iOS 15 over 6 years later, which is insane. But in 2015, we saw iOS 9 release, again bringing more refinements to the huge changes in iOS 7, while still being a very similar experience overall. And the oldest supported iPhone, yeah, the iPhone 4S. Not one Apple device had its life end on iOS 8. Not necessarily a terrible thing, as it had been quite buggy, but it became absolutely awful once you actually started using iOS 9 and realized just how painfully slow it was on this hardware that was nowhere near capable of running it. Well, okay, that's technically not true, because the A5 chipset was dual core, and so technically speaking, the 4S and other A5 devices were capable of running iOS 9. But just because they could doesn't mean they should. And, well, they did anyways. iOS 9 is slow. It's really, really slow. It's always amusing to me whenever I do a video on one of these devices that ended on iOS 9. There are consistently always some comments angry at me for complaining. And look, of course a device on iOS 9 is usable, just like a 4S on iOS 5 is technically usable for a lot of things. Pop in a SIM card and it'll make calls. Heck, during the filming of this video, I was getting annoyed because my white 4S on iOS 5 kept getting pinged every time I got an iMessage. So not only did it ding on my iPhone 13 Pro, it also did on my iPhone 4S on iOS 5. That's crazy. I've been signed in on there for years, but it still works. But that's iOS 5 from 2011. And if you have the patience, iOS 9 will do the things you need it to. It may not have even felt too slow to you back in the day, or heaven forbid right now as you watch this video. But buy a newer iPhone or iPad, or heck, even the latest iPod Touch, and your opinion is going to shift real quick. iOS 9 absolutely chugs, and there's really nothing you can do about it. A couple bandages can be applied maybe with things like reduced transparency and reduced motion that can be found in your accessibility settings, but you're fighting a losing battle from the get-go. I'll try to be fair here. As much as I hate that Apple gave the iOS 9 update to so many devices and thus essentially ruined them all, what seems ruined to me may have been a worthy sacrifice to many. After all, the benefits I mentioned with iOS 8 fully apply here as well. Even if it's slower, you get newer features and more recent app support, to the point that even today there are a couple apps here and there still supporting iOS 9, including, believe it or not, TikTok, of all things. Yeah, TikTok's minimum required version is iOS 9, and I have zero idea why. I do know you should go follow my TikTok account that I unironically have, as there's some great content over there, no kidding, at 91_tech. But yeah, I have no idea why TikTok still supports iOS 9. I suppose maybe they just haven't had a need to drop support, and fair enough if that's the case. Really good on any app developer that doesn't require a newer version of iOS or Android just for the sake of making their lives a bit easier. Using iOS 9 a half-decade after it originally launched, it's hard to say it doesn't feel the age. Even without the slowdowns, it's a lot more similar to what I remember of iOS 7 than iOS 15, though a lot of the foundations are definitely here. It's still inherently an iOS experience, it's just old. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to ignore that the 4S is so darn slow with it. It's absolutely painful to actually try and use even the most basics of basics. I expect old phones to be slow when trying to do anything more intensive or internet-based, but you shouldn't lag this much or even at all just opening settings or pulling down the notification center. iOS 9, whether it was because of the A5 chipset or half gigabyte of RAM, it's an absolute joke, and Apple ought to be ashamed of themselves for releasing it as they did and then never bothering to fix or optimize it for older devices. It's so sad that such a great phone in the iPhone 4S had its legacy butchered by Apple at the very end of its life. For many, it'll still be remembered as that cool new iPhone that had Siri from back in the day, but for the actual users of the iPhone 4S around 2015, 2016, and later, I highly doubt it's seen so fondly. It's amazing it lasted as long as it did, but that's in large part because it never should have. Either iOS 9 needed to be properly optimized for A5 devices, or Apple should have just left them all on iOS 8. As much as it's pretty much impossible to avoid that huge flaw when thinking of the iPhone 4S, on a bit of a more positive note, I do think there's another way to spin the perception of its legacy. Yes, the iPhone 4S was ruined by software updates, and to many served to reaffirm the notion that Apple only gave updates to slow down your device and make you buy a new one, but what we've seen since the iPhone 4S and iOS 9 has proved anything but that, as Apple seems to not only have learned from their mistake and avoided repeating it, they've actually managed to bring it a full step further by taking the time to ensure iOS isn't getting slower, but in some cases even faster. iOS 10 was the final version for the iPhone 5 and 5C, and then with iOS 11, the 5S was the oldest iPhone supported, as Apple now only supported 64-bit mobile devices, and that is where everything changed. The 2013 iPhone 5S was a lot like the 4S in that it was an underappreciated but massive upgrade. It brought the world's first 64-bit chipset in a smartphone with the A7, and the performance really jumped in future devices. Because of this, Apple was able to make yet another break in their pattern of dropping support, allowing the 5S to run iOS 12 when it came out in 2018. It broke that record of 5 years of support the 4S had achieved, and this time did it right, with iOS 12 being a performance-focused update after the buggy mess that had been iOS 11, for perhaps what was the first time old iPhones actually got faster, not slower, on a newer version of iOS, and that was a huge step in the right direction for Apple. And then they confirmed that they had indeed learned their lesson with the 4S by doing something I really didn't think they'd have the guts to do. They left the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus behind on iOS 12 along with the iPhone 5S. This was an important move because the iPhone 6 was very similar in performance to the 5S. Apple giving the iPhone 6 iOS 13 and not the 5S would have felt massively arbitrary and only slowed down the 2014 device, but Apple didn't do that. They retired it in 2019, and now the iPhone 6 still runs iOS 12 just like the 5S. I was beyond happy to see that. As for the iPhone 6S, with its A9 chip, releasing in 2015 with iOS 9, well, it's still the oldest iPhone supported today, getting not only iOS 14 but 15 as well, giving it an insane 7 years of support at least, as it'll be getting updates through to the fall of 2022, and probably not beyond, but then again, I've said that before. The 4S situation was handled so painfully poorly back in 2015, but a bit over a half-decade later, Apple not only has rectified the situation, but managed to go above and beyond what any of us could have imagined. For some, it might not seem like a big deal supporting a 2015 smartphone in 2022, but keep in mind, Android phones are lucky to get more than 2 years of support, and none of them have ever even gotten close to 7 years, at least officially. Apple deserves massive credit for turning things around, and moving forward, that's how I'll remember the iPhone 4S's legacy, as a turning point for the company, a mistake that Apple would learn from and avoid repeating again. Hopefully they'll prove me right and never repeat it again, only time will tell, but I'd say the last few years are a really good sign, and I really think Apple's gonna keep this up in the future. It's hard to fully describe or talk about the legacy of a device like the iPhone 4S. What can you even say? It was huge, just massive to the smartphone world and tech industry as a whole. It shook up everything from digital assistants to iCloud, to huge camera improvements, to Apple Silicon getting better and better, and eventually long-lasting iOS support. The iPhone 4S looked the same as the iPhone 4, but as they say, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, though with that gorgeous design, maybe you should. The iPhone 4S was unveiled the day before Steve Jobs passed away. We were lucky to hear him announce iCloud and other huge new features of iOS 5 the summer of 2011, but it would be his last presentation ever, with his cancer finally catching up to him. Steve Jobs was an innovator, a revolutionary, and one of the most brilliant, forward-thinking people to ever live on the planet, and there may be no more fitting of a close to his own legacy than to have the iPhone 4S, such a monumental device, be unveiled the day before he passed.
You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.